What's up, guys? Connor O'Hanlon here for another episode of the Con O Show. And today we are joined by a long hyped up guest, one that I did mention a few weeks ago, and we had to reschedule, but finally, schedules aligned. And we got Representative Brian Sims, who is a state representative in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and is running to be our next lieutenant governor. So, Brian, thank you for coming on. And did I miss anything in your introduction?
No, you sure didn't. And thank you for having me. I'm glad that our schedules finally lined up.
Yep. And just briefly, I always like to throw like how we kind of all got involved with each other whenever I have a guest on is, Brian was very helpful in my campaign for tax collector, even though I came up 86 votes short. Brian came to the Doylestown Democrats and, introduced himself, offered everybody help. And obviously now this year we get to reciprocate the favors and try to push and get Brian elected to be lieutenant governor. So the first question that I got, I've got a ton of submissions from, fans of the show, fans really of yours, I would say, more so than me. The first one actually, is pretty broad. What motivated you to get involved in politics in general? And then I guess you can kind of spin that into what made you want to be run for lieutenant governor.
Sure. And again, thank you for having me. This is not a difficult question for me to answer. I was motivated by the lack of equality. Everybody who knows me knows that my life's work is equality. I am a civil rights attorney by trade. And when I'm the son of two retired lieutenant colonels in the Army, and I moved to Pennsylvania, back to Pennsylvania after I played college football here, and then moved back after law school, and really didn't know that I was moving to a state that lacked so many basic civil rights. And I spent a good number of years of my career as an attorney, as a civil rights attorney, working to promote equality for all people under the law in Pennsylvania, and especially LGBTQ people like myself. And Pennsylvania was one of the largest states in the United States that had never, and still has not passed any type of pro-LGBTQ statewide LGBTQ legislation. And so I spent a number of years advocating for change, and then back in 2011, there was a data point that was really sticking with me, and that it was that no state that had ever passed any really serious pro-LGBT legislation had ever done so without having an out legislator. And we were the second largest state in the country that had never done that. And so, I spent a year or so, like a lot of people do, thinking it wasn't me and I wasn't the right person and it wasn't the right office. And then sort of got off my butt and decided to do it. And I won my first race by 233 votes.
And for perspective, like how many people would you say was in your district at that time?
I mean, I for whatever it's worth, I have 80 some odd thousand people in my district. I wish all of them voted. They do not all vote. But that number 233 has stuck with me over the years, because I can think of 10 different people that got me 234 votes that year. When you win by a big margin, which I've done a couple of times since, it's easy to think it's about you. And when you win by a small margin, it's so clearly about the people around you and the people that did the work around you. And from my vantage point, what that meant for me is that I had to do this job differently. And it's part of the reason I decided to run for lieutenant governor. To your question earlier, is that but for the fact that I don't come from any money, and I am not heterosexual, I carry every major privilege that I teach people about in the United States. And the only really appropriate use of privilege is to combat the systems that perpetuate it. And so I told my constituents that I wouldn't require my women colleagues to have to get up and talk about the sanctity of their own body before I would do it, because the people that oppose it look just like me. And I told my constituents that I wouldn't wait for my colleagues of color to have to talk about the impact of racism on their family in deeply personal ways, just to make, again, people that look like me have an empathetic reaction for them, and that I would do it. And so what it's meant is that in the most gerrymandered legislature left in the United States, with the most radical Republicans you can find anywhere in the country, that I have sort of been the tip of the spear in the face of the shield on civil rights issues and pushing back against our radical Republicans for the better part of a decade.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I guess this is a weird way that you could spin it, but what would be the most proud accomplishment that you've had in your career so far as a politician? Like, what is the what I know it's tough. Like we have
Yeah.
things that you're fighting, as we always discuss, some pretty radical ideas in Harrisburg. But what is something that you're most proud of in your political career so far?
Um, I, First and foremost, it's the number of LGBTQ and legislators that have run and won in the years since, not just in Pennsylvania but elsewhere. I've obviously been joined by two other out legislators, but I have worked to elect women, to elect people of color, to elect second generation immigrants and LGBTQ people in all corners of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and all across the country. Part of the reason that I have donors and supporters in all 50 states and every county in Pennsylvania is kind of in the same way that I got to know you, is that I think after both doing this job and being a civil rights attorney that I have a good idea of what I'm looking for in elected officials. And that's very different than those that exist right now. And so, I have made sure that aside from just having a vision for a better, more diverse electorate, I've worked my ass off to make it happen.
Would you do you have any, speaking of my election cycle, do you have any reflections on the 2021 cycle that you think would be applicable to 2022 and hopefully a Democratic victory for both yourself and for governor and, across the state?
There's a couple of lessons I feel like I'm learning and that I have learned out on the road. I've been on the road full time since July as a candidate, and I've been a candidate for lieutenant governor for going on 11 months right now. And so, I was heavily engaged in that 2021 cycle and seeing the things that were happening and the things that weren't. Obviously, I invested in this next election cycle as a Pennsylvanian, but as a candidate as well. And the thing that I keep coming back to is that we have to be really clear about who we are as Democrats. There are 650,000 more Democrats in Pennsylvania, but only 88,000 more people voted for Joe Biden than Donald Trump. And what that tells me is that we have a little over 500,000 Democrats that are only going to vote when they're excited about what we're doing, that want to believe that Democrats believe the things that they say and therefore will get their vote. I know that there's constantly this sort of tension about where do we find votes, who do we appeal to? Well, there are a lot more Democrats in Pennsylvania than there are Republicans. And a lot of those Democrats will only vote if they're excited by the messaging, excited by the ticket, excited by what's going on. So I think that's one of the lessons that I've learned. The other is that we oftentimes pretend that somehow the best Democrats live in the major cities and that everybody else is sort of like a lesser or diet version of those Democrats. And that just couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, it's often the opposite. There are places in Pennsylvania where a Democrat can go stand on the corner and say anything they want from the Democratic platform, no matter how lefty liberal. A lot of those places are in my own district, and I'm grateful for it. But the truth of the matter is, the farther you get away from those places, not only the harder is it to be a Democrat and to be loud about your values in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but the more that you have to stand up for them. We all know that our beliefs are best when they are tested, and we know how to push back, and we know how to to offer guidance, advice, and data on the things that we believe. Well, no more is that true than in the suburbs around our major cities and in very rural parts of Pennsylvania. If you want to be a loud Democrat in Butler County, if you want to be a loud Democrat in Carbon County, you got to know your neighbors aren't going to agree with you and they're going to push back against you. So you have to know what you're talking about and not just believe the things that you believe. And so for me, I know that one of the things that we need to do well in 2022 is recognize that there are lots of different types of Democrats, and people aren't more right or more wrong by how much they deviate from like a standard Democratic platform. We need to recognize that Democrats in different parts of Pennsylvania have different needs and require different resources and have different messaging, and that's the right approach, not approach that needs to be homogenized.
Speaking of the platform, what would you consider your top priority, or maybe let's go top 3 priorities for the campaign in 2022, and hopefully when you're elected moving forward for the next couple of years?
It's actually a really good opportunity to kind of tell people, and I'm sure most of the people that are watching know exactly what our lieutenant governor does in Pennsylvania, but not everybody does. The lieutenant governor in Pennsylvania has 3 primary job duties. They are the chair of the Emergency Management Council for Pennsylvania. When the governor calls an emergency order, the lieutenant governor has 72 hours to impanel the right people, experts, organizations, associations to deal with that emergency. The second is to chair the Board of Pardons. Now, as a civil rights attorney, which we've never had chair that board before, I'll tell you that's something that is near and dear to my heart. But it's the third position that is perhaps the most critical, especially of late, and that's oversight of the Senate. For the vast majority of my 10 years in office, the Senate was the more moderate of our two bodies, still falsely Republican controlled because of gerrymandering, but the more moderate. And that changed 4 years ago, and it changed most dramatically just about 2 years ago. You know, it was as though the Republican members of the Pennsylvania Senate saw the radical Republicans from other parts of the country being rewarded for their radical nature and decided to adopt it. And now we've got a Senate that had a member participate in the January 6th insurrection. We have an entire Republican Senate leadership that wanted to overthrow the popular vote in Pennsylvania, that colluded directly with the president to do that. And so this idea of oversight of the Senate is something that is critically important to me, and it's something that I find myself having to explain to a lot of people, that having a person in that room that has lived under these rules as I have for the last 10 years, that understands the ebb and flow of that room, that can understand how to work with democratic leadership to create an environment where the sort of eyes, ears, and voice of the governor are reflected, I just could not think was more important now than any other time in history. And it sounds boring, and it is boring to a lot of people, but it is, as someone who, again, has, I've got 18 pieces of legislation on the House floor, whether it's, equal pay, raising the minimum wage, marriage equality, criminal justice reform, making sure that we're protecting women's rights. All of these are things that are all critically impacted by the administration of the Senate. And that's something that the lieutenant governor has direct control of. For me, I know that the issues that I will get to work on will be the issues that the hopefully Shapiro administration is working on. Right? Like, there's not a single progressive issue under the sun that I haven't worked on in the last 10 years. And whether that's reforming how we do elections or reforming how we elect judges, I hope that I, as the lieutenant governor, will have an opportunity to work on all that legislation, because that means it's moving.
Could you go back to the second part about the pardons of? Could you? I don't know exactly how to phrase it properly, but could you expand upon that a little bit more? I don't know that most people understand how pardons work and all that stuff. So,
well, the precursor is this: is that as a lawyer, I have to acknowledge that the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania and in America is racist. Is built on racist data. For those that thinks that somehow just like a blanket value statement, and maybe to some extent it is, I believe it's also factual. And the reason I believe that is because our criminal justice system is built upon precedent. It's built upon history. It's historical. It's built on data. And the data that went in was racist. How and why and where we treated people differently because of their race or ethnicity or nationality, it has defined so much of our criminal justice system, and defines it even today. And while there are a lot of efforts afoot to make it better, it is still built upon something that I believe is inherently racist. And so the Board of Pardons has an opportunity to review pardons. It's exactly what you think it is. Have an opportunity to review the pardons or to review an application for pardon from people convicted of crimes in Pennsylvania, and decide whether or not that person deserves a second shot. Decide whether or not that person got a fair shot to begin with.
So who broadly makes up that committee, I guess? So you'd be in charge of it, right? So it'd be like you chairing it.
It's exactly what it would be. It would be me chairing it. It's filled, as you can imagine, with a whole bunch of, there's representatives from the criminal justice movement, representatives from the Attorney General's office. It's really interesting. And one of the things that is not talked about often is the interplay between the governor and the lieutenant governors. I mean, it's just really critically important in Pennsylvania, and it's not always been the case where we've had strong relationships between our governor and our lieutenant governor. And I think with respect to the Board of Pardons, being able to work with a governor that believes in criminal justice reform and be able to reflect that reforms when dealing with the Attorney General's office, when dealing with local district attorneys, when dealing with, frankly, when dealing with criminal justice reformers, I think is for me, is one of those areas that is just always going to be really critically important. But that Senate thing is something that, I have seen these rules used time and time and time again in a hyper partisan way. And I've also existed in a gerrymandered legislature where I didn't think that the rules were being used in my first couple of years. I felt like the rules, while they were being used incorrectly by a gerrymandered party, I didn't feel like they were being used the way that they are now. And so to be able to bring some degree of decorum also, but some degree of collaboration back to the Senate, I just think is really, really critically important. I hope in doing that I get to continue to work on equal pay. I get to continue to work on comprehensive sex education, and that I get to continue to work on LGBTQ non-discrimination. And I hope that I will in those ways.
Speaking of being in the most gerrymandered state in the entire country, basically, what would you suggest to people, like average day people like me or anybody watching this? What can we actually do about the gerrymandered mess of a map that Pennsylvania is? Obviously, voting would be one, but how should we try to keep our expectations within check, but also not lose hope and keep optimistic that we can hopefully overcome some of the gerrymandering that's existed?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, as somebody whose entire life's work is impacted by the gerrymander in Pennsylvania and the extent of it, I'm actually more optimistic than I've ever been about the future of Pennsylvania politically. I think that, we already have a Supreme Court in Pennsylvania that has once ruled against gerrymandering on the federal maps. I think that's the same Supreme Court that would rule the same eventually when they get the opportunity on our statewide maps. I think that the Department of Justice has been focusing on the impact of gerrymandering for a number of years, and I hope that they get more aggressive on it. I know that there are Supreme Court cases that are working their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court about gerrymandering, although I now, as you can imagine, have less faith in those cases. You don't have to look much further than Virginia to see what happens when you finally overcome a gerrymander, and that is that within months, you'll begin to see legislation that was once progressive and is now just appropriate being passed all over the place. And so I know that, working with organizations that like Fair Districts PA is the perfect example. Very few organizations have done more to impact, I think, the future of Pennsylvania than Fair Districts Pennsylvania. They make sure that they are constantly reminding people what a maps should look like, what gerrymandering is and why it impacts them. They do a very good job speaking to candidates before they become elected officials and getting them on the record about issues of gerrymandering. And for me, that has been one of those places where I see that work directly translate to support, growth and support for us to fix this, for us to fix the unconstitutional nature of gerrymandering. There is a reality, though, and that is that no Republican is ever going to give us back the control that they have stolen in Pennsylvania. We're going to have to take back that control. It's going to happen in the courts, or it's going to happen because we finally just mathematically overcome the power of the gerrymander because there are so many more Democrats in the state.
Do you ever think that through some sort of, I guess it would have to probably be a legal precedent through the Supreme Court, but there would be a way to ban gerrymandering overall and have the states be forced to use third-party vendors or something like that to create maps for their state districts?
No, I don't know is the quick answer. There are a lot of different processes. We've got 54 micro democracies in the United States to look at for different ways that this is done. And I know that until we reach some idealized bipartisan future with our politics, I'd much prefer a third party doing this. Here's the thing, though, Connor. You can take the average 14-year-old that knows anything about computer programming and put into a computer program the basics of what is required of our districts, and you'd get a map. In fact, you get the map that most people are looking at and using at the time. So it's really the players, the people that are involved. And so if you can remove those people, when I first joined the legislature and was introducing legislation on this exact issue, the idea was how to get elected officials out of the process. And yeah, there's always going to be an issue of who picks the pickers. But in this case, we need to get elected officials and their self-interest as far from the process as possible. And if that means having to use a third party in the meantime, so be it.
Yeah, I'll just say this as not an elected state official, that I believe that we, the people, should pick our elected officials, not the other way around. The elected officials shouldn't be picking the voter constituencies. So we will see as that unfolds currently. This is a very specific question. I'm going to read this. This is something I got from Twitter. One of my fans, I suppose. So it says, with his, meaning you, extensive civil rights background, does Brian have thoughts on the 1215 oral arguments in the lawsuit to prevent PA GOP legislatures from turning over private info, our license numbers, social security numbers, to a random third party? And
it's a great question.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
And that's a terrific question. And like, I feel like we owe a lot of debt to the people that have been fighting this. We owe a lot of debt to the plaintiffs. We owe, this is the idea that somehow Pennsylvania's Republicans are trying to commit the largest data breach in Pennsylvania history on behalf of Pennsylvanians because they have concerns about the election that they themselves created is ridiculous. And it's as nefarious as it sounds. Part of this feels like an Orwell novel. It feels dystopian, and it should. I have a lot of thoughts. My thoughts are just thank you to the plaintiffs who came forward to sue and remind all of us about the extent of the data that would be released about us, and that there is no purpose for that release. And so, I try not to predict what courts are going to do, but this is one of those areas where I just cannot envision a circumstance where our driver's license numbers, social security numbers, voting habits, all of those things are going to be turned over, especially for such obvious partisan hackery. Right? Literally, the basis of this request is that people have distrust of the election process that Republicans created. And so in order to alleviate the problem that they created, Republicans think doing what was before this, the most seemingly un-Republican thing I could think of was to somehow, in like a Orwellian way, gather up everybody's data. Nah. This is the bullshit that it smells like it is.
And it's kind of, it's kind of crazy just with all of this. They were the ones that held the majority. Like, they still held the majority after the election. So it's like, if the election results were rigged or they were falsified, then how come you are holding office? How can you both at the same time claim that it was fake or it was rigged and you won your election? Like, it's ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, and kind of remember that the bill that many of them are complaining about that allows mail-in ballots was a Republican bill. Mm-hmm. Democrats didn't make that happen. Democrats didn't have the power or the authority to make that happen. Republicans did.
And I'll emphasize that the issue where people like, oh, Joe Biden got a giant dump of votes overnight. The same thing happened in my election. I got a giant dump of votes overnight because they're counting the mail-in ballots that is restricted by law not to be able to start counting until, I believe, 8 p.m. on election night. So if you want to,
in my own election,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
In my own election, only 1 in 5, only about 20% of voters in my last election voted on election day.
And when we just analyze that and just say, well, maybe we should be able to open them a week early and start processing them because it takes a while and it goes through each county's board of elections. So like it takes a long time. So it's complete nonsense. And I appreciate you pointing out that they were the ones that passed the bill, and Governor Wolf did sign it, but it did pass as a bipartisan bill, really.
Correct.
So I kind of ask these questions in a little bit of a different aspect for different people, but who would you say are your biggest influences in your life historically or today? Like just, historical figures or people today that have inspired you. It doesn't have to be in political ways or doesn't have to be a political figure. It could just be anybody that have pushed you in your life.
One of them is cheesy, so I'll do that first, and that's Ben Franklin. I have Ben Franklin's first words as the Speaker of the House tattooed the length of my arm in the new Farmer's Almanac font, in Ben Franklin's font. When I was a little kid, I lived in Alaska. My mom was the commanding officer of an army base there, and I mowed lawns. And this quote by Ben Franklin was written on the back of my little kid business card that my mom laminated for me, and it followed me through my life. I lived in multiple states after that, and book reports and projects and law school. I quoted Ben Franklin a lot, even quoted him in court a couple of times as a practicing attorney. And then when I got sworn in, I realized that I now represented a good portion of Ben Franklin's first seat. As you know, he was the last president of Pennsylvania and the first Speaker of the House. And him and his approach to to people have had a massive impact on my life. The quote is, "Be civil to all, sociable to many, familiar with few, friend to one, enemy to none." And it was his philosophy on governing. And it's something that I try to adhere to and try to remind myself of as often as possible, but also to be well rounded. He was a scientist and an artist and, kind of a bon vivant, somebody that really loved life and liked different parts of life. And I want to, try to emulate that and be reminded of that. The other, I have the privilege of having two parents that get to be my heroes. My mom and dad are both retired lieutenant colonels in the Army. They are the children of Army officers as well. They met, during Vietnam and built a life and a love together that is something that has always for me been worthy of a lot of respect. My parents are deeply in love with each other, and when they see this, eventually they're going to be sitting next to each other on the couch holding hands, or sitting on the same side of the table having dinner. And I feel greatly blessed to be their child. The others are sort of a collection of people. I have been around out elected officials for most of my career, and there are a group of out state elected officials: Leslie Herod in Colorado, Julian Sear in Massachusetts, Carlos Guillermo Smith in Florida, Danica Rome in Virginia, that all know what it's like to sort of bear the burden of being a first and to make sure that you're not the last. And they've all become really, really close friends of mine.
Awesome. That's a great answer. It's probably one of the best answers I've ever gotten from a question like that. Spinning off of that, what would you say are some of the other organizations, if people should get involved, people want to do something? Because this is the emphasis of this show has always been, I talk about progressive policies. Sometimes if I don't have a guest, I just talk about current events and whatnot. But the goal of this show is to get people engaged, get people involved, go door knock, go donate, go do something, vote at a minimum. Mm-hmm. What are some organizations that you would suggest people should get involved with, should check out, should follow on social media, et cetera, that you would suggest?
So I spent a lot of time talking to people who feel underrepresented in government about why they should be the representation they are looking for. Barney Frank, my favorite member of Congress, used to say, if you don't have a seat at the table, you are probably on the menu. If you are one of those people that's on the damn menu, right, there are places, Emily's List, Emerge Pennsylvania, the LGBTQ Victory Fund, One Latino. Those are organizations that are helping people who historically have not had the opportunity to engage in politics because resources kept them out, helping them to develop the base to have the resources to be able to run. And so I always urge people to go there. The second is candidates. I think all of us have a penchant, of course, to feel partisan these days because the parties are behaving so differently from one another. But the truth of the matter is, if you're out there and you want to get really engaged right now, I think the best way to do that is to find candidates that you can believe in and go do work for them. Yeah, some days that means knocking on doors and mailing envelopes, but oftentimes it means strategic help, helping with issues that you have an expertise on that maybe your candidate doesn't, or being able to help to identify areas where your candidate isn't strong and be able to help fill those gaps. I think right now that there are more women, there are more LGBTQ people, there's more first and second generation immigrants, there's more people that come from moderate backgrounds running for office right now than at any time in U.S. history. And all of those experiences oftentimes teach candidates a lot of lessons about other people's lives that are useful. And so I would suggest if you look around and you don't see yourself well represented in the people around you, first, consider please becoming the candidate. But secondly, also finding candidates out there that are doing the things that you believe in and supporting them. Every election cycle, every campaign, every candidate needs help. And if you're interested, helping is a really big way to do that.
Yeah, every well-organized campaign is really in the background, not as well organized as it may appear. Everything is chaotic. It's a constant chaos. Again, I always say, if you can do something, try and do it. Just get out there and make it happen. When I graduated from Penn State, the second I graduated, I said, what can I do? I showed up to Doylestown Democrats, ran for office by the next year. I'm the chair now. So it's in that short of time, things change. Somebody at that time, 23 years old, taking advantage of a system that is there. It's set up. We can just go and take it, like you're talking about with many other things. We're not just going to be handed power. We're not just going to be handed, here's equal rights. No, we had to fight for those things, and we're going to have to continue fighting for those.
Exactly.
What would you say is your best coping strategies or your best strategies in staying optimistic, engaged, encouraged through the times of struggle? I mean, just speaking personally, I know sometimes like I feel like, oh man, like this is really, really bad. And I have to like disconnect for a little bit and just feel like take a step back and then I'll come back. But what would you say are your best strategies? Because you're always going at it, basically.
Yeah, yeah, I am. And, I'll say, like all things, if I have strategies, it's because I've realized what not having them looks like. And, this kind of stress that we're all living under can be really corrosive and can be really dangerous. I think I have two things that seem to help me a lot. One is I spend a lot of time outdoors. I stay mostly at state parks while I campaign. I sleep in a lot of tents and a lot of cabins. Everyone's always surprised to hear that. They think it's cute. And I always stop and say, no, it's my mental health. It's good for me. I like that I smell like a campfire. And, I like that usually the last thing that I do at night isn't turn off my lights. It's turn off, blow out a candle or go, put out a fire. It just helps relax me. It helps to center me. And it's something that in the 10 years I've been in the house, I've really learned to do a lot of. I even stay at a state park nearby as often as I can, even when we're in session. The other is not as glamorous, but a lot more important. And that is that because of the work that I do and because the work I do is so value laden, I get to see, or I know of so many people whose life experiences are so much worse than mine, right? Like in my day to day, I fight for all these things that aren't happening. I fight against all these people fighting back against me. I get called awful things. And yet my day is still filled with a lot of privilege. It is still filled with, people that I love and a roof over my head. And, and a lot of the people that I fight for don't have it the way that I have it. Right. So perspective, I think, has been really helpful for me. If you're a trans Latina in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania right now, your average day might be worse than my worst day. And so it's really important for me to both try to check out and get private time, but also the perspective of really thinking on the people that I'm impacting and the experiences that have been shared with me.
Do you, I know we talked a little bit last week while you were driving. Do you find driving is actually a good, when you drive, and this is, we're going to get real personal here. When you drive, do you have a certain playlist? Do you have a certain music you listen to that you could possibly just kind of like jam out to? Like I definitely have my go-tos, but do you have that for yourself?
Yeah, yes and no. It's been kind of taken from me of late because of campaigning for lieutenant governor. I average about 1,000 miles a week on the road, and that's a lot of hours. And most of it are spent doing call time. I spend a lot of my time on the road is spent raising money. Unfortunately, when it's not, it's usually I do. I have lately it's a lot of Ella Fitzgerald and Etta James and the Rat Pack. That changes sometimes, and if you catch me at the right mood, I listen to a lot of Grateful Dead. I listen to a lot of Pearl Jam. I don't know. Like everybody else, I'd like to think my musical preferences are like a reflection of my mood in that moment. What I don't do is I rarely drive in silence, even if it's just Christmas tunes in the background. I like that.
Yeah, you gotta have something. I mean, I should have known that you probably have to do call time in the car, but you gotta have a backup playlist for when you're not having that.
Yep.
My what's it called? What guilty pleasures have been like adding up as of late with my happy mix, because I've been trying to boost the mood going into work and all that stuff. But I guess, what would you consider like one of the, or I guess throw that out. Do you even have time to read ever?
I read a lot, but it is legislation, it's white papers, it's research, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I haven't sat down and read a recreational book in probably 6 months. And the last one that I did was about like camping in the wilderness.
So I was going to ask you, like, what was your favorite book, or like, what is a book that has like inspired you in your life? I know, like, it's probably really hard to find time. It's hard enough for me to find time to read, but like with your schedule, I can only imagine.
Um, as you say that, I'm sitting here thinking, God, I have read a lot. I mean, part of being a lawyer, part of being interested in the world is reading a lot. There's a book called "The Boys in the Boat" about the U.S. rowing team that I think it was a fantastic book that was really really important for me. I, I hate saying this because it's going to sound so trite as a former college football player. But the Friday Night Lights was a book that, as a kid, had a massive impact on me. As a young person, had a massive impact on me, and sort of recognizing the socioeconomics of high school sports and how they were impacting me and my life, and this, what it looked like to be from a community that cared more about athletics than academics, and that was something that was really, really deeply meaningful to me.
Um, I want to give a little pause in between your answer and my question. So if you were listening to this, pause it after my question so you can guess. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below your guess. All right. What position did you play in football? So pause it if you're listening, take a guess, because my guess was absolutely wrong. I thought Brian.
Did you think I was a middle linebacker?
I thought you were a linebacker. Yeah. I mean, you're bigger than me. You're bigger than me, but you're built in the same way. You're kind of like if you took me and like took the picture and like dragged it like diagonally a little bit. So you just stretched me a little bit taller, a little bit bigger. So I just assumed like, oh, he was probably a middle linebacker. But you can give your reveal as to what position you played.
I will say this before I do. Most people think I was a quarterback because they hear that I was the captain of my college football team. Everyone just assumes I was a quarterback. I was not. I was a defensive tackle. I was the strong side defensive tackle. So I rotated left and right side based on the play. And I was a significantly bigger person when I played football.
Oh, how much did you bench back then? That's also something we all have to know.
Yeah, I was bench pressing just around 500 pounds.
All right, that's the meathead.
And squatting just around 800 pounds.
There you go. The meathead in me is satisfied. The power lifter is satisfied. Yeah, I get the answers that everyone is burning to know. With that, do you have any closing remarks or anything that you really want to emphasize for people moving forward into this election cycle?
Mostly just that if you're the kind of person that is watching this, your friends and your life know that you are the political person. Like every one of us can identify the sports person or the race car person or the foodie in our lives. Every one of us knows that person. But if you're the kind of person watching this, you're the political person in your friends' lives, which means that right now more than ever, they need to know what you're up to, why you're up to it, how they can do some of it. There's never been a better time to engage people on this particular topic. We are not our parents' generation. We're not people that can't talk about money, sex, or politics. In fact, we often talk about those things too much. We need to not dodge the political question. For the next 5 months, we have a really critical race in the primary and then on to November. And it's easy for elected officials to say this is the most important election of a lifetime. I actually think our last presidential election was the most important election of a lifetime. But I do know that what's going to happen in Pennsylvania over the next 5 months and over the next year is going to be the epicenter of politics nationally. We have an opportunity to change the makeup of the Senate, and Republicans feel like they have an opportunity to elect a Republican governor. And so my only ask, my only urge is I urge you all to please talk to the people in your lives. Let them know why you're watching a lieutenant governor primary candidate get interviewed 5 months before the primary, because you know it's important and you need to share that with them.
That's a great message. Where I assume anybody watching this probably knows where to find you, but where can people find you? Where can people go check out your website and Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff? Like, give us your links and your plugs.
I can do that. My website is sims4pa.com, the number 4. I am Brian Sims PA on most social media platforms. I'm usually pretty easy to find. And you can find me all over the state. I am on the road full time, and I will be on the road full time until, I assume, until next November. I was in 7 different counties in 72 hours this weekend alone. And so I I suspect that if you're looking to meet me or hear from me, you're probably going to. If you want to call me or message me, my cell phone number is 215-266-4696. Connor's going to check this and realize that's the same number he has. It's the same number my mom has. It's the phone I'm talking to right now. It's not a work number or a campaign number. It's just my number. And if you want to reach out, you've got an idea about legislation, you need help, you're interested in the LG race, whatever it is, shoot me a message.
I'll attest to that. That is your phone number. I know it because that's how you gave it to me the first time.
Yep.
And I respect that a lot. I respect the openness and the transparency. That's what we want in our elected officials. So that's all I have for us. If you guys enjoyed the show, please, if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button down below, hit the like so you can get more people to watch maybe someday. Leave a comment. Again, take a guess. You should have already taken a guess by now, but if you have anything that you want me to know about the interview or anything, leave it in the comments below. You can follow me on Twitter at Con O'Hanlon, on Instagram, same thing. The show is on Facebook, Instagram, and patreon.com/The Con O Show. You can support the show for as little as $5 a month to help us keep the streams going and paying our editor, because he does a lot more work than I do. But yeah, so Brian, thank you so much for coming on, and I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody else, stay safe. I'll see you next week. Have a good one.